Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's talk on the networking channel. We will be having a panel today on the topic of how the internet evolved outside of the United States. And the motivation for this is that there's a lot of history written on how the internet evolved in the United States, but less is known on how the internet grew up in other countries. And so in this panel, we will hear about how the internet became introduced into Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. The panelists will talk about the history of these efforts and give a sense of the unique challenges and describe lessons learned from these early days that can be applied today and to the future. We are very lucky to have present some mothers and fathers of the international internet. We have Randy Bush, who is fellow and network operator at Internet Initiative Japan, which is Japan's first commercial ISP, and a member of technical staff at Arrcus Incorporated. He specializes in network measurement and automation, especially routing, network security, and IPv6 deployment. He was a founder of the Network Startup Resource Center, an NSF-supported pro bono effort to help develop and deploy networking technology in developing regions. We also have Kanchanasut, who is a professor at the Asian Institute of Technology. She is the first Thai to establish an email connection to the world. She was among the pioneers to establish Thailand's research and education network. She registered the .th domain name, conducted Thailand's first TV white spaces trial, and started the first open and neutral internet exchange point, EKNIX. TACnet, which she steers, is the first community network in Thailand. We also have Edmundo de Souza Silva, professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He is a member of the advisory board of the Brazilian National Research Council and is a researcher 1A of Brazil. In 2017, he was recipient of the title Builders of the Internet, granted by the National Education and Research Network in recognition of his essential role and important contribution in the construction and development of the Brazilian academic network and the Internet of Brazil. So these are our speakers for today. And we also want to mention that the networking channel is a series of talks, and next week we will have a talk on the upcoming 6th generation cellular standard, technologies behind it, and future directions. We would like to invite you to come. All of our talks are open and free and open to everybody. And with that, we can start the panel. We would like to invite you to participate. You can ask questions on the Zoom. If you would, please use the Q&A feature. It's a little bit easier for us than the chat. It's a little bit easier for us to see your questions. But we also do have a Slack channel, and the panelists will try and remain on the Slack afterwards to take your questions and interact with you. And with that, we'll start with Randy Bush.
Apologies, but I will ask you to endure a few slides. And I want to start with, I think there's a taxonomy of how things moved south. And by that, I mean, as Matt said, we normally focus on the northern growth of the internet and was all heavily funded, et cetera, but in the South, I'm going to think mostly of America, Latina, and Africa. I think of things as self-started by some passionate pioneers. And I'll tell you the story of one. There was heavy use by NGOs and societal organizations way back when in the early 80s, into the 80s, and through the early 90s. And then there was much funding for special connections for science, funded by American and European science organizations like the US National Science Foundation to get to physics and high energy physics and astronomy in the South. And then there was some international aid for education, health, et cetera. And I think of these as the main drivers. But first, I'm going to take you back to some 1980s technology because Kanchana told me that there will be significant audience that didn't live through the technology then. And there were these wonderful things called modems, which connected a PC to the telephone network. And they took the data from the PC and turned it into tones and sent it at between 300 and 20K baud over dial-up telephones. And there were networks where the PCs would call each other and transfer data from that were stored on their disks and transfer them to the telephone network, and then they would be received by another waiting PC. So email and files were stored until the connection were made and then sent forward. So this was known colloquially as store and forward. And there were two main technologies used. One was with Unix systems, and it was the Unix to Unix copy program. So the Unix systems would call each other and transfer files back and forth. Now, some of those files would be compressed email, and when it got to the receiver, it would be uncompressed. But since this was a directed graph, there was no addressing other than what we call bang path addressing, and the word bang comes from the Unix for the exclamation point. So an address consisted of the path. So if you wanted to send mail to me from Europe, you would somehow get to Philips Labs, then MCVax, then DECVax, then Tektronix, then Oregon Software, then M2 Xenix Ferranti. That was my address. Okay, and this was heavily in the north, and then came south, but as you will see, it was more in Africa than America Latina. And in Africa, it was more the NGOs who did this way back in the 80s. Also in Africa was Fidomet, which was an amateur bulletin board network. Bulletin boards were services you dialed up locally and could read email and send email, etc. At its peak, there were about 5,000 of them worldwide. It was similar to UUCP, but it was hierarchic. It was store and forward. So you were down at the bottom, and your node would call up one level at a fixed time of day, up, and then it would transfer between continents and come back down. Okay, so my address down there at the bottom was continent 1. Portland, Oregon was 105. 6 was my computer, and 0.1 was my email. There is still Fidomet today, but its transport is, it's very small, and its transport is actually over the internet pretty much. So if you look back to, for instance, in '93, the NSF asked, could we please have, we're sending scientists over to, for instance, in this case, it's Africa, and they're in Botswana. How can they get email? How can they send it home? So a list was developed for every country of what you could do. And you will notice that most of these entries are Fidomet, and they're from groups like the Association of PeaceNet, Orstum in East Africa, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., are UUCP nodes from a French group who put them in the universities, etc. And this was all dial-up. One notable one was Egypt, where a woman by the name of Nashwa Belbaki, who was in her early 20s, actually connected out via BitNet, which was another dial-up technology. And she networked 13 universities with 5 protocols, BitNet, DECnet, Novell, X25, and the beginning of the internet, all by herself. So this is kind of how these were the early networks and what was happening then. So as an example, in '88, a computer scientist, a compiler professor, and I was into compilers in those days, he came to a conference in the States and saw that his peers were communicating with each other. And he said, how's this happening? So we gave him a Fidomet disk that he took back to his South African university, Rhodes University, kind of the Stanford of South Africa, where there were engineers. And I want to underline where there were engineers, because I think that's key. In 2 years, they had migrated from Fidonet to UUCP to TCP/IP and connected many South African universities and also small colleges, etc., and then 4 neighboring countries. Out of this, by the mid-90s, came the first commercial ISPs in Africa. But notice it was an individual who wanted to communicate. And the seed was planted in engineering in the country. A friend who I'll tell you a bit of his story, Jose Soriano, said, in our case, that of America Latina, in most of the countries, the governments were absent. The companies, by that he means the telephone companies, arrived late, and everything depended on the passion and effort of a few. And Jose was a very passionate pioneer. He used the net in the '80s while exiled in France. In '91, he got small funding from NSF, OEA, which is the Organization for American States, and UNDP, and he gathered engineers from 5 universities in Lima who had never met each other before, and he used the funding to get a couple of machines and 2 northern engineers to teach locally and then support the group. It became the Scientific Network of Peru, Red Científica Peruana. It started as a research and engineering network, but spread to serve across the society. He had a mission to connect his entire country, education, medical, NGO, even military. He put kiosks in the Andes Mountains and the villages where the life expectancy is 25. Some years later, the telcos noticed. The telco was colonized by Telefónica España, and that consumed the research network, and it became commercial telco network. In '94, we looked at this and we said, what gets it done? A user community, no matter how small, local engineering talent, right? You can upgrade them, you can teach them, you can educate them, but there have to be engineers on the ground. Any connectivity to start. Social physics and time will take care of the rest. You serve users' needs and they multiply faster than you can serve them. Users whose needs are being satisfied discover ways to get more and better bandwidth. Sometimes the Northerners want to connect to resource. In '95, the International Mathematical Union elected a Kenyan as a chair. The National Science Foundation wanted to get them internet. They funded a Fidomet node to convert to TCP, sent equipment and a teacher. Today, Kenya is the major hub of East Africa. You cannot do a international financial transaction in Kenya without using the internet. Okay. It works well when the resource is science or education. Okay. But Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica connected for astronomy or physics. But natural resources, not education. Many countries have significant natural resources, which giant global corporations exploit. These corporations all have in-country connectivity, and they do not give one packet to the people whose resources they are exploiting. The classic and worst examples are Nigerian oil and Guinea bauxite for aluminum. The other negative I would bring up is grand initiatives. Naive Northerners making grand plans to network multiple countries in the South. And the US government did the Leland Initiative to give an internet to 10 African countries. They made contracts with 10 telco companies, killed the local networks, and set them back years. So be careful and wary of well-dressed Northerners in suits bearing initiatives. On the other hand, local initiatives such as internet exchange points drive local, social, and engineering cooperation. They reduce costs and reduce latency. They're great places for cooperative networking. The internet is a result of local action. And that's it. From Kanchana.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's great. So next, we're going to have Kanchana say a few words.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to share my experience. First, I would like to take you back to the mid-80s in Southeast Asia. At that time, our phone services were extremely expensive, yet they were not widely available. That we could not rely on the long-distance phone call for dial-up connectivity. We communicated by snail mail, telegrams, telex, and fax. Around the same time, our friends in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand were already enjoying email, at least within their academic circle. Each early groups of Southeast Asian countries that joined the net were in late 80s and early 90s. That includes Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Connections to the email and subsequently to the internet were driven by demands from within the country, with students who returned from overseas studies, international faculty members, and expat community, all wanting to move the countries forward. So the problem of expensive communication had to be resolved. The remaining countries joined the net in the late 90s and early 2000s, based on advices from external international organizations that it was time for them to get connected. I will share my personal experience with the Thai case as an example of how we managed in those days. My story began like this. With colleagues from Norway and Japan at my institute, we explored all possible paths to reach any email network internationally. We did not succeed. We heard that packet switching service was coming, but it was indeed a very long wait for us. Until around middle of 1986, we received a brochure from our telco, the Communication Authority of Thailand, regarding their new database service called IDA, as shown on the slides. After our inquiry, we found that we could use their service to do remote login to host on TimeNet or Telnet with X25. Each of us could then use remote login, use their facility to do remote login to access our mailboxes in Australia, Japan, and Norway. From there, we started to work on UUCP with the limited resources that we had. This slide shows our lab in the 80s. In December 1987, my Japanese colleague bought the first Sun workstation, so we had a real Unix from that day. The machine is shown on the bottom left corner, and the same machine is still in our lab. The machine in 2022 is shown on the right-hand side. This machine became our first email gateway to UUCP internationally. We tested UUCP with Munari Australia, UUNet in the US, and INRIA France, and University of Tokyo, Japan. We found that UUCP with the US was the best among all of them because of the quality of the phone lines. It was indeed very rare for us to get a smooth and successful UUCP session. Robert Ellis, an Australian internet pioneer, kindly listened attentively to our complaints and came up with a solution. In July 1988, the Australian Computer Science Net donated their Sun 3 or MHS Net system for us to use among the Thai university with Unix machines. This system was more efficient than UUCP on noisy and slow phone lines. .th was then registered to accommodate hierarchical names to be able to use Sun 3. Informally, we formed Thai Computer Science Net with Prince of Songkhla University and Chulalongkorn University and AIT. TCS Net was a special member of the Australian Research and Education Network, ARNet, with the main gateway at Melbourne Uni. So, as from July 1988, we were on the internet with .th. We owe the Australian International Development Programme and ARNet for their support. We are indebted to our guru Robert Ellis and Professor Juris Reinfeldt of the University of Wollongong, who made all this possible. Next, how to scale and how to convince our boss, because we had no budget to move this activity forward. I called for a meeting at AIT in December 1991, which for many of us it was the first time we met in person. This meeting was very successful, leading to the first ping to UUNet in the US in June 1992, and also a domestic network connecting key sites in Bangkok. In 1995, we had a commercial ISP. Our first commercial ISP appeared with the Communication Authority of Thailand as one of their shareholders. .th moved from Jula and AIT to THNIC in 1999, while or the IP address allocation left to APNIC. During the 90s and early 2000s, many internet organizations were initiated around the world. This period was when we got to meet internet colleagues from other countries in person. We did not meet them before that. The human network behind the internet was instrumental for the success of the internet. And this period was indeed very, very impressive for me. I got to know so many kind people, and the atmosphere of helping one another was really touching. Everything was new. Our Ministry of ICT and our regulator were set up during that period. They often ask us for references from international UN organizations or presidencies from other countries, which we never had. Everything was new. So having international organization formed for internet was very helpful for local players like me when talking to our government officers. As today, with the exponential growth, naturally we have problems. With more freedom and openness than the PSTN time, governments and regulators could not keep up with the new technology and its implications, not to mention cybersecurity or privacy. But just looking at the internet connectivity alone, we are now facing with the impact of the freely growing internet. At least two problems deserve our attention. The first one, with the open internet, some big companies, globally big companies, are doing injustice to poorer users in poorer countries. For example, today, internet users consume content like video clips, movies, and games. Local ISPs have to try to make their customer happy. They have to go out to get the content from the content provider to deliver to their customer, or deliver it to their customer at acceptable speed. So if you are in well-to-do countries, big content providers may come to you, setting up their facilities near you. Government in these countries could argue for fairness on your behalf with big company to protect the business of their own operators. But when you are from a poorer country, ISPs have to struggle on their own to reach the content provider who may set up their facilities at a regional hub. For example, in Singapore, for the case of Southeast Asia, where local providers have to compete among themselves, trying to pay for their international transit themselves to go out and get the content for their customers. No protection from their government, against the big company for them. So shared infrastructure could have been helpful to reduce redundancies and costs, but for many years, such arrangement was not supported by some of these big content providers. I would say that it happened with some content provider, not all, because there are some fairer ones around as well. The second problem that we found is to do with the fiber to home. For the past 5 years or so, ISPs have been competing very hard to offer the fiber to home services. These pictures show how a mega city like Bangkok has become as a result. Operators do not want to share infrastructures, so each one lay their own network. It is not only an eyesore, but as shown in the center, a few weeks ago, a bunch of cables in one business district of Bangkok caught fire, and this happened, very frequently. It's not well reported. Bangkok City is now trying to put cables underground, but the problem has already spread nationwide. With so many government agencies involved, it is much harder to organize.
Okay, great. Yes. And next, Edmundo is going to say a few words.
So, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And let me share the slides. It's a pleasure to be here with Randy, Kanchana, and thanks to Matthew and Serge. And I guess it's very interesting the experience in other countries match some of keywords match pretty much things that I'm going to say. So Kanchana just mentioned the key of network with people, and Randy also mentioned several issues that are very similar to what happened. So I'm going to provide you uh, my perspective and what happens in Brazil, and then the connections. So in the beginning, that was early 80s, that have been preliminary talks at how to interconnect university from uh, uh, early, let's say, computer science people that graduate outside from many from US and Europe. They come back to Brazil and didn't have a connection. There are a lot of talks about that. Specifically, Rio, there has also been a project to interconnect in a few universities and to study the OSI standards at that time. But there was no money to pursue about that. And there's preliminary talks about interconnection the universities inside the state of Rio de Janeiro. And same thing was happening in another big state of Brazil, it's São Paulo. Uh, so by mid 80s, let's say a few young researchers that they informally meet to discuss issues on how to connect to the NSF net. So you can imagine, like Kanchana also pointed that out. So you come back to your PhD, go to university, and you are disconnected from the world. You have only to rely on expensive telephone calls, or you are virtually disconnected. I remember myself, I have some ties with IBM Research Center, and I had to go to IBM premises to get a connection to talk to my colleagues in the United States. Uh, and there was no sharing with academic computers. I guess Randy mentioned that was completely separate. So you have a big task, was to convince people to monetary issues, to convince people that that was a good idea and how to connect to the US, etc. And in Brazil, in particular, there was a monopoly of the telecom industry. And I should say industry because there's only one big government company. It's called Embratel, and there was even a law that said you only Embratel could share links. So if you want to have links to the university, we cannot share that link with other universities. That has to be dealt with, and many other issues. So our strategy was approach we did this, try to obtain permission to connect to an NSF. At that time, that was required. Then approach also government officials in Brazil to change the link share restrictions that we have and convince them that that was a good idea. And in parallel, we tried to work in the state of Rio de Janeiro to support a regional network. And the state of Sao Paulo had also, let's say, similar effort to create a regional network. So, in fact, these efforts happened before NSFNet launched the internationalization plan. So I put a picture here to try to give a very tiny idea that what was happening. There are people, let's say, I participated in group trying to talk mostly to people outside the Brazil, United States. The reason is I have projects with people like people from UCLA, Dick Bunds, and then Mario Gela, who unfortunately passed away. So Mario introduced a nice guy, which is from UCLA Latin American Center, was Larry Lauerhouse, that also unfortunately passed away. He was very active, tried to connect libraries, UCLA libraries that had a very big library from Latin American and Brazil, and libraries in Brazil. So that was driving force. So he was also key. So Mario, and then Len Kleinrock, because connection to UCLA and connection to NSF. So in the Brazilian side, we had the Brazilian community to try to make CNPq, which is our research agency like NSF in the US, to support academic network. And many talks about that. In the state of Rio, there's also FAPERJ, it's a state agency trying to support that. And there were key people inside those agencies that started talking and agree with everything we would like to do. And finally, at the bottom, RNP was created. So a national research network in Brazil to try to connect the universe. But at that time was no money. So we didn't have money to establish. So it was created in the paper, but nothing happens. And okay, so to give an idea of timing, is a letter from 1987 from Larry Landweber. So he's talking in the name of NSFNet to grant to Brazil permission to connect to the US. So, and that didn't happen fast because of protocol issues and other, we have to, let's say, put a link to the US and have to overcome the issues about sharing the link and then to have money to get the link to the US, etc. This is another email from Steve Wolf from National Science Foundation that we exchange, and it was congratulations that is essentially CNPq was our research network was created. Now he would be willing to help and everything. He was helping before since '87. So say other efforts in Sao Paulo, people from physics, that's another big academic community in Brazil, physics was pushing to connect to Fermilab against the same thing because of research ties. And University of Sao Paulo, Demi is a colleague from Sao Paulo was pushing that in the computer science community. And so both Rio and Sao Paulo joined BitNet, or we wanted to connect to NSFNet, but because of issues and protocol issues, it was easier to start with BitNet. We just connect IBM computers that were ready and no protocol issues, nothing, we connect that. That happened in May '89. And for that point, let's say my universe was paying for the link to the US. the link would go direct to UCLA. And was interesting that Randy mentioned those early protocols. I could go on and on forever, talking about funny stories that happened at that time. So in September '89, our National Research Network created, but no funding. And what about the '90s? That was the '80s, the '90s. So in July 1990, our research funding agency announced RNP finally we get funded. So more like 2 years later. And they asked us, so this group of people, to continue the efforts towards with NSF until the National Research Network could be formed and established and everything like that. So eventually, my university connect to San Diego Supercomputer Center after UCLA, and connect to the regional network. Then soon after USP, which is University in Sao Paulo, connect to Fermilab and the regional network. So their picture that we first, so these are regional network that was paid entirely by government and state of Rio de Janeiro, and the link was paid by the university because there was no national money to pay for that. So we connect to BitNet. Then July '90, we tried the first connection and it had an issue with protocol. So eventually, in 2 years later, finally have the official connection. And talking about picture, this was a PC that do a remote login to UCLA and connect to the library at UCLA. There's lots of officials to that inaugurator. It was very nice, the feeling of being able to access resources at university. A lot of people had graduated in Brazil. And then same year, USP connected to Fermilab and to São Paulo Regional Network, and driving that effort with colleagues in São Paulo. And what's funny, so one thing I noticed, that we couldn't talk to São Paulo researchers and other parts of Brazil through Brazilian links. We had to go to the United States to exchange traffic. So this was very interesting to send a message between those two cities that are 500 kilometers apart. You have to go to the US. That's the way it was done. And that kept for some time until National Research Network started to lead the expansion of the network in Brazil. Remember, that was government money. And then led the creation of other regional networks in Brazil, and then led the efforts to connect to Latin America and countries in Latin America, Argentina, Chile. They, at that time, are also connecting based on the research ties, and then eventually we connect to them, led by National Research and Educational Network in Brazil. And then in 2004, the Clara network that congregates all Latin America and was created, and RNP established cooperations with Europe and so on and so on. So what are the lessons, I guess, my point of view, we learned? Very key, the involvement of academic community. That was key for our development, I guess, from talks from Randy and Kanchana. That was true for them as well. The people in academia got together, they have ties to people from outside. In our case, ties with academics in the US, it was essential. They helped a lot to go all what was needed to connect to the network. And cooperation, and I emphasize cooperation. We need cooperation. That's what we had at that time. And the creation of our National Research and Education Network was not easy. To find funds for that was not easy, but that was fundamental, and that was government money. And it was created with, in fact, with the freedom to act, which was also very important. and close ties with the academic community. And it led all the other details to expand the network, like domain and et cetera, et cetera. So all was done by RNP at that time. And since then, funds have been reasonably stable because of the way the National Research Network was created. It was meant to connect all public institutions in Brazil, all universities, all and then schools, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a big driving force to do that, and they have committees to evaluate the performance of a national research network, et cetera. So nowadays, so what's the present? Kanchana mentioned the expansion of private enterprise. That's the same thing in Brazil. We have a few major ISPs, but the funny thing was a lag was created in the interior of the country, so that small ISPs spread all over. We have thousands of small ISPs trying to connect the interior of the regions, and the National Research Network also being using their connectivity to reach the interior of the country and other parts of less connected the country. So connecting everyone is still a challenge because of poverty, hard to achieve regions. Recently, there's been a cable trying to go through the Amazon River. That's already a big challenge. And again, National Research Network is leading that effort. And government support is still essential nowadays. Research, international cooperation, and many issues, and try to show what the future is for the to bring the future inside the academic network. Pandemic, it was fortunately, and again because of the National Research Network, we were able to connect easily. That was not an issue to connect universities and schools, etc. The issue was poverty. Students didn't have ways to connect when they are in their homes. So that's an issue. And I would like to bring something, I guess, is all over spread. The spread of social networks, fake news, which has been a big problem in Brazil and I guess all over the world. So my final question is to maintain, improve cooperation ties around the world, and that's the key, I guess, to the future. Involvement, academic and government money is key. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. We can move on to audience questions. So feel free to start asking questions, continue asking questions in the Q&A feature on the Zoom. We're going to start off with one question, which is about the relationship with the United States to the internet. So many of the protocols and design decisions of the internet were created in the United States. Were there any of these decisions that were found to be inappropriate or less optimal for your regions when kind of deployed outside the United States? You know, how do you feel about internet standards? Are standards bodies inclusive of regions you work with? Do you feel they take the needs of your region into account? Or are there areas are there issues in your area that are ignored? Do any of you have thoughts on this question? Yeah, Randy?
I think the biggest and most obvious is character set. There are plenty of people who find the 26 letters of the American language to be a little restrictive. Kanchana. But I think the protocols, as far as transport, held up pretty well. The congestion collapses and issues like that of the early 80s were taken care of before the spread to the South. So the tolerance for slow lines, etc., was actually pretty impressive. I mentioned the link to South Africa to Rhodes University. It was running at 9,600 bits per second over PCs using IP TCP, and kept the link loaded with very few drops, good congestion control, etc. So the base technologies were good. The application layers on top, the early web was tied to the Latin alphabet. All the documents were written in English. So getting, and in recent years, the ITF, for example, has put in considerable effort to get people from the South brought into the standards process. But, like in everything else, this is slow.
Yeah, that's great. Kanchana?
Yeah, I think I'm with protocol. I mean, for networking protocol, we are not so worried about that. But as Kun Randy mentioned, we are more concerned about using our local languages on the internet. For example, we cannot right now. We have domain name in local languages, and we started to have email addresses in local languages. But so many, big platform, they still don't accept the standard which came out from IETF, but they just don't practice. How to enforce that? We don't know how to do it. This is more important than, designing protocol or anything. Just how to get people to follow what came out from the standard body, standard organization. Yeah, thank you.
Can I say some words?
Yeah, go ahead, Edmundo.
Yes, like Kanchana said, we didn't have problems with protocols. I saw there was a funny thing that I may mention when it first started connection, is an inauguration day, the connection, because we had a satellite line, there was a TCP issue. That was funny to correct. And fortunately, we could correct that with the help of people, because this TCP over a satellite line, and the protocol was connected, was, let's say, default was landline, a short latency. But anyway, that was just a curiosity. But we didn't have issues, and because of the language in Latin America, Spanish or Portuguese, that was not an issue. And the standards, say nowadays, even early, people from the National Research Network and other communities in Latin America, they are participating in these international organisms, and so that has not been an issue, like Kanchana said.
Okay, great. Yes, that's very helpful. We have another question from the audience. Would the panel shed light on the key challenges in technologies, funding, team building, and policy support faced in their pursuits, and key lessons learned from tackling those challenges? You all have any thoughts on that?
I can start, or whoever.
Yeah, sure, Edmundo. Yeah.
In our case, the key issue was money and support from the government. So that's why I mentioned in the talk, there was a group of people from the university, let's say researchers, that wanted that badly to happen. And a lot of people got involved to trying to convince the government and convince people that was worth it to put money to establish a national research and educational network. So many people, was a group effort. And once we had that, we were able to change things and find money, but without government support. And it started from the states, I should say. The states, Rio and Sao Paulo, they push the rest, and then the federal government to put money and well establish over the country. But without the cooperation and effort from everyone, that would be impossible, I guess.
Yeah, Randy?
So I think Edmundo has more of a top-down view of the proliferation, and I'm a little more bottom-up, or that was my experience, and still is today. So I see heavy issues of exploiters wanting to come and, for instance, own and monetize a country's domain name. And that it takes people like Kanchana locally, with local engineering and local cooperation across the different aspects of the society, education, government, NGOs, and the commercial interests cooperating to make successful local networking. And the other major example of this is, of course, internet exchange points, where, for instance, the monopoly telcos are at first extremely reluctant to participate because they see it as sabotaging their income. And yet it benefits the society, it benefits all the ISPs, and it benefits the users. So it takes a while for this to shift. And it's very few countries, Edmundo, that the government actually helps there. Saudi Arabia is the outstanding one, where the government said, and it was interesting, their motivation, they didn't want traffic between two Saudis to leave the country. So it was political. And they are in a government condition where they can dictate. They are a true kingdom. I'll stop.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's see. We have another question on regarding today's situation. In order to connect the developing regions, is it mostly a policy or economic issue, or both? Are they enabling technology? There's a recollection of Kanchana experimenting with ad hoc and D22 in the Thailand forest. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
I'm waiting for the others. If
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, Kanchana, your hand is your hand up, Kanchana?
Yeah.
You can go if you want. Yeah.
Sorry. I think the problem of getting, by today, most governments know about the internet and how important to get everyone to build a network. So I'm not so worried about policy, but I'm more worried about how the government handle this kind of connectivity, the infrastructure that they are trying to build and provide to the people, because they end up, they get excited and they put a lot of money, try to build very big infrastructure for the people, but very soon the project finish, everything is forgotten, everything is left alone. I mean, things are left to the community to handle, and you find a lot of things left untouched and not used, and the money is totally was totally wasted. So I think it's better to try to get the local people to own the network instead of putting something into their their community and leave everything. Yeah, I'm more worried about wasting our time and resources than policy, because everyone has very nice policy nowadays. Thank you.
Brady, do you want to go first, or?
What Kanchana said, I think it's empowering the local people to, the technology's there, you can teach it, you can provide it, though you have to be careful. I have a long rant on techno-colonialism that goes, from selling old equipment to the South to all sorts of ways of bad exploitation. But I think the technologies are there and available, they're known. The how to do things are somewhat known, but when you're in an isolated situation and just starting, you might get something constructed, but there's 12 possible directions from here. Which one do you take? So being able to communicate and get experiences from outside and cooperate with the global internet is, I think, critical. Kanchana mentioned the 1993 INET meeting in Stanford and those workshops. I think when you look around, especially in both America Latina and Africa, many of the networks are run by the engineers who were trained and taught in those workshops. And so I'm still a bottom-up kind of guy.
I agree with everyone. That's important, and money is, and policy. We have well-established policies, and what I just want to bring up, what experience what happened in Brazil, and it surprised me in the last several years, is to the big ISPs didn't put effort to go inland, and then the small ISPs, because of technology was cheap enough, they were able to do that with support of the communities. And then suddenly we have 3,000 ISPs, or in that order of magnitude. And again, because we have a national research network, they exchange points, they benefit from the connection to the national research network and everything. So, but what's interesting, I totally agree with both, the involvement of people, the community, and spread, and cooperation is a key, of course.
Can I have 1 minute? I
Yeah.
think it is very important today to try to use the academic and research network, and with the team build, try to do team building and gather the collaboration within the academic community, and try to help, connecting rural or, the rural area. Well, I would say this is what I try to do, but I hope other people can try to not to follow, but try to copy maybe. We'll be happy to help you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's great. There's another question on why were countries faced, some of the countries you talked about were facing, dire issues like civil wars and lack of clean water issues. Why were these countries willing to spend resources on networking? What was their thought process at the time? Was it the right decision? How did you convince them to spend resources on computer networking?
Education is something. You can jump in, but
I'm not so sure the countries did it. My theory is about people. And I think there are people in most of these countries who had motivation to communicate. As Edmundo says, the educators needed to connect to educators in the rest of the world, both to produce information and to consume information. But the commercial enterprises, even in war-torn countries, etc. I'm working with the DRC currently, which is in horrible shape, but they're still on the net and people are doing their best. It's not, I think as things break down as they do in war-ravaged countries, I think less and less the government is strong and more it's individuals. I think this week we're getting to watch that in the Ukraine.
That's great. Yes. Any other thoughts on that question? Kanchana, do you have any thoughts?
Mike, Kanchana, you're muted.
Oh.
These countries spend money on networking, even though they have other problems, more urgent problems. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I think by today, everybody realized that they have to live with the internet and they have to catch up with what's going on. So internet and information is part of their security. So national security is the most important for this kind of country. So I would understand why they would invest.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So with that, we're going to end the panel. We thank the speakers very much for their input. We will try to keep the conversation going on the Slack, so please join the Slack if you would like to keep discussing with the speakers. We want to remind you there's a very exciting talk next week, or 2 weeks from now on 6G. We hope you will attend that. And thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Looking forward. Bye-bye.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Bye-bye. Ciao.